The key turning in the lock used to be the sound of comfort, the signal that her world was complete. But on a rainy Tuesday in October, it became the sound of a life being torn apart. For Sophie, 8 months pregnant and humming a lullaby in a nursery, she'd painted sunshine yellow. That sound marked the end of everything she knew. Her husband Ethan didn't just walk out the door. He bulldozed their shared future for a life with another woman, leaving Sophie with nothing but a mountain of debt and a child he no longer wanted. This isn't just a story of heartbreak. It's the story of a woman left in the rubble who decided not to cry, but to build an empire from the dust. The air in the small apartment on Elm Street was thick with the scent of fresh paint and impending joy. Sophie stood in the doorway of what would soon be the nursery, one hand resting protectively on the taut globe of her stomach, the other holding a damp cloth. The walls were a cheerful shade of yellow, the color of daffodils and new beginnings. A half-assembled white crib stood in the corner, its instruction manual spread on the floor like a sacred text. For the past 3 weeks, this room had been her sanctuary, a physical manifestation of the love she felt for the tiny life growing inside her, and for the man she shared that life with. Ethan, her husband. He was late tonight, but that wasn't unusual. As a senior associate at the prestigious architectural firm, Sterling and Finch, long hours were the norm. They were the price they paid for this life. The cozy apartment, the dinners out, the future that shimmered so brightly on the horizon. A future that included their son, whom they'd already decided to name Leo. Sophie smiled, tracing the outline of a tiny, fluffy cloud she had just painted above the crib. Leo's little sky. The familiar sound of the key in the front door lock finally broke her reverie. "Ethan, you're home," she called out, her voice warm with relief. "I was just finishing the clouds. You have to see them." She walked out of the nursery, wiping her hands on her jeans, her smile ready. But it faltered the moment she saw him. He stood in the entryway, his expensive trench coat dripping rainwater onto the welcome mat. His face, usually so open and expressive, was a closed, hard mask. He wasn't looking at her, but rather through her, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. He held his leather briefcase in one hand, gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white. "Ethan, is everything okay at work?" she asked, her heart beginning a slow, nervous thud against her ribs. He finally met her eyes, and the coldness in them was a physical blow. This wasn't the man who had whispered dreams to her in the dark, who had gently kissed her swollen belly that very morning. This was a stranger. "We need to talk, Sophie," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He didn't move to take off his coat. He didn't move to kiss her. "Okay," she said, slowly, her hand instinctively going back to her stomach. "Let me just get you a towel." "Don't." He snapped the word sharp enough to make her flinch. "Just sit down." He gestured towards the living room sofa, the one they had picked out together, arguing playfully over fabric swatches. She moved towards it, as if in a daze, every instinct screaming that her world was about to tilt off its axis. He remained standing, a prosecuting attorney before a defendant. "I'm not happy, Sophie." He began the words clinical and rehearsed. "I haven't been for a long time." Sophie stared at him, bewildered. "What are you talking about?" We were just planning the baby shower last week. You were so excited." A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed his face. I was trying to make it work for the sake of the situation." "The situation," She repeated the word, tasting like poison. You mean our baby? Our son. It's not that simple, he said, pacing now, the motion agitated. There's someone else. The 3 words hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Sophie felt like she'd been plunged into ice water. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The yellow nursery, the half-built crib, the scent of paint. It all seemed to belong to a different life, a different woman. Who? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Her name is Vanessa, he said, and the way he said the name with a sort of reverence was another knife in her heart. She's a new partner at the firm, a client from the Langford development. We've been seeing each other for 6 months. 6 months. The timeline crashed through her mind. 6 months ago, they were celebrating their 2nd anniversary. 6 months ago, they were joyfully trying to conceive. He was with this Vanessa while he held her, while they planned their family, while he told her he loved her. The nausea that rose in her throat had nothing to do with her pregnancy. She understands me, Sophie. Ethan continued, his voice gaining a self-righteous conviction. She sees my ambition. We connect on a level you and I just don't anymore. A level I don't. Sophie found her voice a tremor of fury running through it. I gave up my career as a graphic designer to support yours. I moved to this city for you. I am carrying your child, Ethan. What level of connection is deeper than that? It's not about that, he said, waving a dismissive hand. It's about intellectual synergy, about a shared vision for the future. Vanessa and I are going to be a power couple. We're closing a multi-million-dollar deal in Monaco next month. He spoke of Monaco and power couples while she stood in their 2-bedroom apartment covered in paint, her body heavy with his child. The sheer cruelty of it was breathtaking. So what happens now? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. You just walk out. I've already put a deposit down on a new condo with Vanessa. In the Zenith Tower, he said, naming one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. My things are being picked up tomorrow. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the arrangements. The finality of it was absolute. There was no discussion, no remorse. It was a business transaction, a life, a marriage, a family being liquidated. The arrangements? She echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. You can't be serious. Ethan, look at me. I'm 8 months pregnant with your child. You can't just leave. This is the part I knew you wouldn't understand. He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. The baby complicates things, I admit. But it doesn't change the fundamental truth. I'm in love with Vanessa. Being here with you would be a lie, and I won't live a lie. So you lied for 6 months instead. She shot back, her grief momentarily eclipsed by a white-hot rage. He had the decency to look away. I wanted to find the right time. The right time. When Ethan, after our son is born. Were you going to wait until I was in labor to tell me you had a new family? He didn't answer. He just walked over to the desk in the corner and pulled out a checkbook. He scribbled something, quickly tore out the check, and placed it on the coffee table. This should cover you for a few months, he said, his tone that of a man settling a bill. To get on your feet. Sophie looked at the piece of paper. It felt like the ultimate insult. He thought he could buy his way out of his vows, his responsibilities, his own child. She stood up, her body trembling, and walked over to the table. She picked up the check, looked him straight in the eye, and slowly, deliberately tore it into 4 perfect squares. She let the pieces flutter from her fingers onto the floor. I don't want your money, she said, her voice shaking but firm. I want you to leave. Now. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty appeared in his eyes. He had expected tears begging hysterics. He had not expected this cold, defiant strength. It unnerved him. Without another word, he turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. "My lawyer is Robert Peterson," he said, his back still to her. "He'll be in touch." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, a sound of profound and irreversible finality. The silence he left behind was a deafening roar. Sophie stood frozen in the middle of the living room, the torn pieces of the cheque at her feet. Her gaze drifted to the open door of the nursery, to the cheerful yellow walls and the empty half-built crib. The scent of paint was no longer joyful. It was suffocating. She sank to her knees, a single guttural sob tearing itself from her chest. Her hands wrapped around the child that the man she loved had just abandoned. The perfect life she had so carefully painted had just been washed away in a storm she never saw coming. The first few days after Ethan left were a blur of disbelieving silence. The apartment, once a cozy haven, transformed into a cavernous, echoing tomb. Every object was a painful reminder. The coffee mug with the chip on the rim that was his. The indentation on his side of the bed. The single stray sock she found under the sofa. Sophie moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching the surfaces of a life that was no longer hers. The moving company had been brutally efficient, stripping the apartment of Ethan's presence in under an hour, leaving conspicuous, dust-free rectangles on the bookshelves and empty spaces on the walls where his architectural prints had hung. Reality crashed in, not as a single wave, but as a series of relentless, bone-chilling tides. The first was financial. When she went to pay for groceries, her debit card was declined. A humiliating call to the bank confirmed her fears. The joint account had been cleared out. Ethan had taken everything, leaving only the exact amount of the cheque he'd offered, and she'd torn. Her name wasn't on the lease. It was a corporate apartment rented through Sterling and Finch. An eviction notice, polite but firm, arrived within the week. She had 30 days to vacate. The emotional toll was even greater. Sleep offered no escape, her dreams filled with the cold, dismissive look in Ethan's eyes. She'd wake up gasping for air, her hand flying to her belly. The baby's kicks, a frantic, fluttering reminder of her terrifying new reality. She was going to be a single mother, unemployed, soon to be homeless. Her best friend, Olivia, became her lifeline. A fiercely loyal and pragmatic ER nurse, Olivia showed up the day after Ethan left with 2 large grocery bags and a face like thunder. She didn't offer platitudes or gentle sympathies. She took one look at Sophie's pale, tear-streaked face, pulled her into a bone-crushing hug, and then got to work. "Right," Olivia said, her voice brisk as she began unpacking groceries. "First we eat, then we make a plan. Crying is allowed, but only for 20-minute intervals. After that, we strategize." Sophie, who hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, could only nod numbly. Olivia made her a simple omelette and toast, sitting with her at the small kitchen table while she ate in silence. "Did he say anything else?" Olivia asked gently, her earlier brusqueness softening. Sophie shook her head, pushing a piece of egg around her plate. Just that his lawyer would be in touch. Robert Peterson. Olivia's eyes narrowed. Peterson of Peterson, Klein and Associates. He's a shark, Sophie, a corporate barracuda. Ethan isn't just leaving you, he's preparing for war. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through Sophie. War. She didn't have the energy to get out of bed, let alone fight a legal battle with a high-powered attorney. "What do I do, Liv?" she whispered, her voice cracking. I have nothing. He controlled all the finances. I left my job. My savings are almost gone. This apartment is the first thing we deal with," Olivia finished for her. "You're moving in with me. It's not negotiable. My spare room is a mess, but it's a room. It's safe." The offer was so kind, so simple, that it broke through Sophie's numbness. Fresh tears welled in her eyes, tears of gratitude this time. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking, I'm telling," Olivia said firmly. "We've been friends since we were 10 years old and survived Mrs. Davison's chemistry class together. We can survive this asshole. Now finish your eggs." The call from Robert Peterson came 2 days later. His voice was smooth, polished, and utterly devoid of warmth. He informed Sophie that Ethan was offering a one-time settlement of $10,000, contingent on her signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and waiving all future claims to spousal or child support. "Child support," Sophie repeated, her voice shaking with rage. "He's waiving his rights to his own son. Mr. Hayes feels it is best to make a clean break," Peterson replied coolly. "He believes a lump sum payment provides you with the immediate resources to start a new life unencumbered by future entanglements." Unencumbered by his own child. The sanitized corporate language made it all the more grotesque. "Tell Mr. Hayes," Sophie said, her voice dripping with ice, "to go to hell." She slammed the phone down, her hand trembling. The bravado lasted for about 5 minutes before the crushing weight of her situation returned. She was turning down $10,000 money she desperately needed out of principle. But what good was principle when you couldn't afford diapers? The lowest point came a week before she was due to move out. She was trying to pack, but the task felt monumental. Every box she filled was an admission of defeat. She sank down onto the floor of the half-dismantled nursery, surrounded by boxes of tiny clothes and unread parenting books. The yellow walls seemed to mock her with their false cheer. The grief was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She felt utterly, completely alone. She wasn't just losing a husband. She was losing the entire future she had believed in. She was a failure, a discarded pregnant woman nobody wanted. She curled into a ball, her body racked with sobs, her hands clutching her belly as Leo kicked within, oblivious to his mother's despair. She cried for her lost love, for her unborn son's lost father, and for her own shattered identity. She cried until she had no tears left, leaving her feeling hollowed out, a fragile shell of the woman she used to be. Lying there on the cold wooden floor, surrounded by the ruins of her life, Sophie finally hit rock bottom. The silence of the empty apartment was broken only by her ragged breathing. There was nowhere to go but up. But in that moment, she couldn't even imagine how to stand. The first few weeks at Olivia's apartment were a period of suspended animation. Sophie existed in a fog, moving between the spare room bed and the living room couch. Olivia was a patient, unwavering presence, leaving food for her checking in, but mostly giving her the space to grieve. She handled the logistics of moving Sophie's remaining possessions into a small storage unit, a task for which Sophie was endlessly grateful. The turning point didn't come with a dramatic epiphany, but with a quiet, mundane craving. One dreary afternoon, as rain lashed against the window, Sophie was struck by a sudden, intense desire for her grandmother's lemon and lavender cake. It was a taste from her childhood, a confection of comfort and unconditional love. Her grandmother Eleanor had been a baker, her kitchen a magical place of warmth, sugary air, and gentle wisdom. She had passed away 3 years ago, leaving Sophie with her treasured handwritten recipe book. On a whim, Sophie asked Olivia if she still had the box labelled Kitchen Fragile from the storage unit. Olivia, sensing the first flicker of life in her friend, in weeks retrieved it that evening. Sophie carefully lifted the worn, leather-bound book from the box. Its pages were brittle and stained with vanilla and butter, the familiar cursive script a balm to her soul. She found the recipe, its instructions, intertwined with Eleanor's little notes. Be patient with the zest. That's where the sunshine lives. Olivia's kitchen was small, but it had the basics. Sophie found flour, sugar, eggs. She sent Olivia out for lemons and dried lavender. As she began to measure and mix, something inside her started to shift. The familiar rhythmic actions were meditative. Creaming the butter and sugar, zesting the lemons, folding in the flour, each step was a small, manageable task in a life that felt overwhelmingly chaotic. The simple act of creation was an antidote to the destruction she had endured. As the cake baked, a fragrant, hopeful scent filled the small apartment, chasing away the stale air of despair. When it was done, she drizzled it with a simple glaze and sprinkled lavender buds on top. It looked exactly as she remembered. She and Olivia sat at the tiny kitchen table and each took a bite. The flavor was a revelation, bright, sweet, floral, and deeply comforting. It tasted like sunshine. It tasted like hope. For the first time in over a month, Sophie felt a genuine smile reach her eyes. "It's good," she said, surprised by the simple pleasure of it. "Good," Olivia exclaimed, her mouth full. "Sophie, this is art. This is the best cake I have ever had in my entire life. No exaggeration." That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. But for the first time, it wasn't because of anxiety. An idea, fragile but persistent, had taken root in her mind. What if she could do this? Not just for herself, but as a way to build a life. The next morning, she baked again. A dark chocolate and sea salt tart. Then a batch of oatmeal cookies with cardamom and orange. Olivia took the extras to the hospital, and they were devoured by her colleagues in minutes. Nurses started stopping by their apartment on their way home, pressing cash into Sophie's hand and asking if she had any more of those cookies. A tiny home-based business was born out of Olivia's kitchen. Sophie started an Instagram page, posting simple, beautiful photos of her creations. She called her nascent enterprise Haven and Hearth Confections. The name felt right. She wasn't just selling baked goods. She was selling comfort, a small piece of sanctuary in a chaotic world. Orders started trickling in from friends of friends, then from strangers. She specialized in unique flavor combinations, inspired by her grandmother's book. Things you couldn't find in a typical bakery. Her days took on a new rhythm. She would wake early, bake while the city was still quiet, manage her orders and social media, and rest in the afternoon. The work was demanding, especially in her final weeks of pregnancy, but it was hers. Every dollar she earned, every rave review she received, was a brick in the foundation of her new life. One of her regular customers was a kind, elderly gentleman named Mr. Davies, who lived in the same apartment building. He ordered a small cake every Friday, always paying with a crisp $20 bill and telling her to keep the change. He was a retired accountant with a sharp mind and twinkling eyes. One Friday, as she delivered his weekly rosemary and pear tart, he invited her in for a cup of tea. "Young lady," he said, after they had chatted for a while about her fledgling business, "you have a remarkable product and a tremendous work ethic, but you're thinking too small." Sophie was taken aback. "I'm just trying to make enough to afford diapers, Mr. Davies." "Nonsense," he scoffed gently. An artist should never be content with just selling sketches. You have a brand here, a story. Have you considered a stall at the weekend farmers market or approaching local coffee shops? He then spent an hour talking her through the basics of a business plan, profit margins and scaling. He saw something in her that she hadn't dared to see in herself, not a victim, but an entrepreneur. The conversation with Mr. Davies lit a fire in her. He wasn't just offering advice. He was offering a roadmap. He helped her register her business, apply for a spot at the prestigious City Central Farmers Market, and create a simple, effective budget. He even offered her a small interest-free loan of $2,000 from his own savings to cover the initial setup costs for the market stall, telling her to consider it an old man's investment in a sweeter future. 2 weeks before her due date, Sophie worked her first day at the farmer's market. She was exhausted, her back ached, and she was terrified no one would buy a thing. She sold out in 3 hours. Standing behind her little table, surrounded by the fruits of her labor, making change for a customer, as her baby kicked gently inside her. Sophie felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It was a tiny victory, but it was a start. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building, one cake at a time. Leo was born on a crisp November morning, a healthy, beautiful baby with a tuft of blonde hair and his mother's determined eyes. Holding him in her arms for the first time, Sophie felt a love so fierce and absolute, it eclipsed all the pain that had come before. This tiny, perfect human was her why. He was the reason she had to succeed, the motivation behind every early morning and late night. The first few months were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and the constant sweet scent of milk and baking flour. Juggling a newborn and a growing business was the hardest thing Sophie had ever done. She would bake with Leo, sleeping in a sling against her chest, the rhythmic hum of the stand mixer often lulling him to sleep. She learned to type emails with one hand while breastfeeding, to negotiate with suppliers while rocking a fussy baby. Olivia remained her rock, often coming home from a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital, and taking Leo so Sophie could have a few precious hours of uninterrupted work or sleep. The farmer's market stall became a local sensation. People lined up for her signature creations, the lemon and lavender cake, the salted caramel and chocolate tart, the Earl Grey shortbread. She had a story that resonated with people, the single mother building a life for her son. A local food blogger wrote a glowing piece titled "The Sweetest Revenge," and suddenly Haven and Hearth Confections was the talk of the town. The income from the market and a few standing orders from coffee shops was enough to get by. But Sophie knew she couldn't operate out of Olivia's tiny kitchen forever. The loan from Mr. Davies had been a godsend, but she needed a real investment to grow. She spent her nights after Leo was asleep, meticulously refining the business plan Mr. Davies had helped her create. She researched commercial kitchen rentals, packaging costs, and potential retail locations. Her big break came from an unexpected source. One of the coffee shops she supplied, the Daily Grind, was a small independent chain with 3 locations. The owner, a savvy businesswoman named Sarah Chen, was impressed not only with Sophie's products, but with her professionalism and drive. "Your stuff flies off the shelves," Sarah told her one afternoon, as Sophie made her weekly delivery, "and your branding is fantastic. People aren't just buying a cookie, they're buying into the Haven and Hearth story. What's your next move?" Sophie, emboldened by weeks of research, took a deep breath. "I want to open my own shop, a small bakery and cafe, a place that feels like a real haven." Sarah listened intently as Sophie laid out her vision. She showed her the business plan, the sales figures from the market, the projected growth. Sarah, who had built her own business from a single coffee cart, recognized the same spark in Sophie. "I know a space," Sarah said, a thoughtful look on her face. "On Hawthorne Avenue. It used to be a bookstore. The rent is high, but the foot traffic is incredible. It would be perfect for you." She paused, then added, "And I know some investors who look for exactly this kind of passion-driven, scalable local business. Let me make a call." The meeting was set for the following week. Sophie was terrified. She bought a new blazer from a consignment shop, created a professional presentation, and arranged for Olivia to watch Leo. She walked into a sleek, intimidating boardroom to pitch her dream to two stone-faced investors friends of Sarah's. She spoke with a passion and clarity that surprised even herself. She didn't just talk about profit margins and customer acquisition. She talked about the feeling of home, the power of comfort, and the legacy she wanted to build for her son. At the end of her presentation, there was a long silence. Then one of the investors, a woman named Catherine Royce, leaned forward. "Ms. Grant," she said, "that was one of the most compelling pitches I've heard all year. We're in." They offered her a seed investment of $75,000 for a minority stake in the company. It was more money than Sophie had ever imagined. She walked out of the building in a daze, the signed term sheet in her hand, feeling heavier and more valuable than gold. Meanwhile, miles away in the sterile luxury of the Zenith Tower, Ethan's life was not the glittering success he had envisioned. Vanessa was beautiful, ambitious, and exciting, but she was also demanding and materialistic. Their power couple life was a performance, a curated series of expensive dinners, charity galas, and Instagram posts. There was a hollowness to it, a transactional quality that left Ethan feeling strangely empty. He thought of Sophie occasionally, usually late at night. He imagined she had probably gone back to her parents' house defeated. He pictured her with the baby, his son, a complication he had successfully excised from his sleek new life. He once saw the food blog article about Haven and Hearth confections on a shared social media feed. He'd scoffed. "Good for her," he'd said to Vanessa, a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Making cupcakes, how quaint." Vanessa had glanced at the article, her perfectly sculpted lips tightening into a thin line. "That's the woman you left?" she'd asked, a hint of something unreadable in her voice. "She seems resourceful." Ethan didn't recognize the woman in the article, smiling confidently behind a table laden with beautiful pastries. The Sophie he had left was broken weeping on the floor of their apartment. This new version was a stranger to him, and a small, unwelcome seed of curiosity was planted in his mind. He dismissed it quickly. He had made his choice. He had chosen power, ambition, and Vanessa. He had everything he ever wanted. Or so he told himself. Back on Hawthorne Avenue, Sophie signed the lease for her new bakery. The space was dusty and smelled of old paper, but it had large front windows and beautiful exposed brick walls. Standing in the middle of the empty room, with Leo cooing in his carrier, she could see at all the glass display cases filled with treats, the small wooden tables where people would gather, the open kitchen where she would create her future. It wasn't a half-painted nursery built on a lie. This was real, and it was all hers. 6 months after securing the investment, Haven and Hearth Bakery opened its doors. The transformation of the old bookstore was breathtaking. Sophie, using her dormant graphic design skills, had created a space that was the physical embodiment of its name, warm, inviting, and stylish. Exposed brick, reclaimed wood, soft lighting, and the irresistible aroma of baking butter and sugar created an atmosphere that was instantly calming. The opening day was a phenomenal success. The line stretched down the block, fueled by the bakery's considerable social media buzz and local press coverage. Sophie, moving between greeting customers and putting the finishing touches on a fresh batch of croissants, felt a joy so pure it almost brought her to tears. Olivia was there, effortlessly managing the cash register, and Mr. Davies sat at a corner table beaming with pride like a proud grandfather. Even Sarah Chen from the Daily Grind stopped by, giving Sophie a knowing, triumphant smile. This was her victory, witnessed by the small village that had helped her build it. The bakery quickly became a beloved neighborhood institution. It was more than just a place to get coffee and a pastry. It was a community hub. Sophie knew her regulars by name. She hired her first 2 employees, a young, aspiring pastry chef and a friendly barista, freeing her up to focus on developing new recipes and managing the business side. She was no longer just a baker. She was a CEO, a boss, a creator of jobs. The success was not lost on Ethan. He drove past the bakery one afternoon on his way to a meeting. He saw the cheerful, professionally designed logo, the crowd of people inside, the warm glow spilling onto the street. He saw Sophie through the window, laughing with a customer looking radiant and confident. She wore a stylish apron over a simple dress, her hair tied back, a pen tucked behind her ear. She looked happy. She looked powerful. It was a jarring image that didn't square with the narrative he had constructed for himself, that of the broken woman he had left behind. The encounter, however, came at a city-sponsored Taste of the Town festival. Haven and Hearth had a prominent booth, and Sophie was personally handing out samples of her new seasonal creation, a spiced pumpkin and maple tart. The line was one of the longest at the event. Suddenly a shadow fell over the counter. Sophie looked up from the customer she was serving, and her smile froze. It was Ethan, and beside him, clinging to his arm, was Vanessa. Vanessa was exactly as Sophie had imagined, flawlessly beautiful, dressed in an impeccably tailored designer suit, her expression one of bored superiority. Ethan looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. "Sophie," he said, his voice strained. "Fancy seeing you here. This is quite the setup." "Ethan," Sophie replied, her voice steady and professional, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. She nodded politely at Vanessa. "Welcome to the Haven and Hearth booth. Would you care to try a sample?" The offer threw him off. He had expected an emotional scene, perhaps some lingering bitterness. This cool, detached civility was disarming. Vanessa let out a small, condescending laugh. "We don't really do street food," she said, her eyes sweeping over the booth with disdain. "But it's adorable what you've done, really. Turning a little hobby into all this." The word hobby was laced with poison. Sophie felt a flash of anger but refused to let it show. She simply smiled. "It's certainly more than a hobby. It's my business, my career, and it's doing very well." Ethan shifted his weight, clearly, wanting the interaction to be over. "Well, we should go. We have a reservation at the Clove Club." He named one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in the city. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to reassert his status. But before they could leave, a well-known voice boomed from behind them. "Sophie, my dear, these tarts are a triumph, an absolute triumph." It was Walter Sterling, the senior partner of Sterling and Finch, Ethan's ultimate boss, a man of immense influence and a notorious gourmand. He was holding a half-eaten tart, a look of genuine delight on his face. "Mr. Sterling, I'm so glad you like them," Sophie said, her smile genuine now. "Like them, I love them. I want to order 3 dozen, for the firm's client reception on Friday," he declared, pulling out his phone to tap the details in. He then noticed Ethan and Vanessa standing awkwardly to the side. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Sterling asked, his tone shifting from jovial to professional. "I didn't take you for a man of the people." He then looked from Ethan to Sophie and back again, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Wait a moment. Grant Hayes. You're the one he—" Mr. Sterling, a shrewd and perceptive man, let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. Ethan's face paled. Vanessa's polite smile became a rigid mask. Sophie, seizing the opportunity, extended her hand to the older man. "It's a pleasure to officially meet you, Mr. Sterling. I'm Sophie Grant, and yes, my team and I would be delighted to cater your reception." She had calmly and completely taken control of the situation, networking with her ex-husband's boss, while Ethan stood by, rendered impotent. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. As Mr. Sterling discussed delivery details with Sophie, Ethan grabbed Vanessa's arm and pulled her away, muttering a hasty goodbye. They walked away without looking back, but Sophie could feel their humiliation like a heat wave. Vanessa was furious. "Did you see that? The way he looked at us, the way she acted so smug. You told me she was nobody." "She was nobody," Ethan insisted, but his words lacked conviction. He had just witnessed in stark and public fashion that Sophie was now very much a somebody. She was a respected business owner, a peer of his own boss, and in that moment, in front of the man whose approval he craved most, she had made him feel small and insignificant. The sweet taste of his new life was suddenly unmistakably bitter. The encounter at the festival was a crack in the pristine facade of Ethan and Vanessa's life. For Ethan, seeing Sophie's success firsthand, and the respect she commanded from his own boss, planted a seed of doubt that began to sprout, watered by the growing dissatisfaction in his own life. The intellectual synergy he'd boasted of with Vanessa had revealed itself to be a shared, relentless ambition that left little room for genuine connection or warmth. Their conversations revolved around money, status, and appearances. The Zenith Tower condo felt less like a home and more like a showroom, beautiful but cold, lacking the scent of fresh paint and shared dreams that had once filled his apartment with Sophie. For Vanessa, the incident was a threat. Sophie wasn't supposed to succeed. She was supposed to fade away, a sad footnote in Ethan's past. This thriving, confident version of her was an unwelcome complication, a rival in a game Vanessa was determined to win. Her possessiveness over Ethan intensified her criticisms, becoming sharper, her demands more extravagant. The gilded cage had begun to rattle. The real unraveling, however, began within the walls of Sterling and Finch. Gregory, Ethan's longtime partner at the firm, was a meticulous and cautious architect who had always been slightly wary of Vanessa's aggressive corporate style. He started noticing irregularities in the financial projections for the Langford development, the very project that had brought Vanessa and Ethan together. Figures seemed inflated, and timelines for material acquisitions didn't quite add up. He raised his concerns with Ethan, who, blinded by his infatuation and his desire to impress Vanessa, dismissed them. "You're being overly cautious, Greg," Ethan had said. "Vanessa knows what she's doing. This is how big deals are made." But Gregory couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He began his own quiet investigation, working late into the night, cross-referencing invoices and supplier contracts. What he discovered was a carefully constructed web of deceit. Vanessa had been systematically overbilling the project through a series of shell corporations, funneling the excess funds into an offshore account. The primary supplier she had insisted on using, a company called Apex Innovations, was owned by a man named Simon Reed, Vanessa's former business partner and ex-lover. They were siphoning millions from Sterling and Finch, planning to bleed the project dry and then disappear. Meanwhile, Sophie's catering for the Sterling and Finch reception was a triumph. The firm's wealthiest and most influential clients raved about the sophisticated pastries and impeccable service. Walter Sterling was so impressed that he offered Haven and Hearth a permanent corporate contract to supply all their client meetings and events. It was a massive, game-changing deal for Sophie's business. The irony was not lost on her. The firm that had enabled her husband to discard her was now becoming her biggest client. One evening, desperate and seeing the walls closing in, Gregory went to the one person he felt he could trust to be discreet and who had a vested interest in the truth, Sophie. He found her at the bakery long after closing, sweeping the floor, while Leo slept in his stroller in the corner. He laid out his evidence on one of the cafe table's bank statements, falsified invoices, corporate records, linking Vanessa to Simon Reed. "I know this is a lot to ask," Gregory said, his voice heavy with stress. "But Ethan won't listen to me. He's been completely snowed. This is going to destroy him, and it could ruin the firm. You're the only one who ever seemed to be able to get through to him." Sophie looked at the documents, her heart pounding. It was worse than she could have imagined. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a calculated criminal conspiracy. She felt a strange, detached pity for Ethan. He had thrown away his family for a woman who was using him as a pawn in a multi-million-dollar heist. A week later, Ethan showed up at Sophie's apartment door, the one she now rented in a quiet, respectable building 2 blocks from her bakery. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt with dark circles under his eyes. His expensive suit was wrinkled. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Sophie hesitated, then stepped aside. Her small apartment was filled with the signs of her new life. Leo's toys scattered on the rug, sketches for new cake designs on the coffee table, the lingering scent of vanilla. "Vanessa left," he said, sinking onto her sofa without being invited. "She's gone, cleared out the accounts, took everything. Gregory presented his findings to Sterling this morning. There's going to be a full-scale investigation. I'm going to be ruined, Sophie. My career is over." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. "I made a mistake," he whispered. "A terrible, unforgivable mistake. She was a fantasy, a mirage. You and Leo, you're my reality. You were always my reality. I was just too stupid to see it." He reached for her hand. "Please, Sophie, let me come home. I can fix this. We can fix this. For Leo. For us." Sophie looked at the man before her. The arrogant, cold stranger from that rainy October night was gone, replaced by a broken, desperate shell. For a fleeting moment, she felt a pang of the old love, the memory of the life they were supposed to have. But then she looked past him at the life she had built on her own. She thought of the terror and the tears, the lonely nights, the back-breaking work. She thought of Olivia's unwavering support, Mr. Davies's quiet faith in her, and the pride she felt every time she turned the key in the door of her own bakery. She gently pulled her hand away. "There is no home for you to come back to, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but unshakable. "You burned that house down, and you're not welcome in the one I built from the ashes." She saw the last glimmer of hope die in his eyes. He had come to her expecting absolution, a soft place to land. He had fundamentally misunderstood the woman she had become. She was not his backup plan. She was not a harbor in his storm. "I need you to leave now, Ethan," she said, walking to the door and opening it. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and despair. He finally understood. He hadn't just lost Vanessa and his career. He had lost Sophie completely and irrevocably. He stumbled out of the apartment and into the hallway, a man who had traded a treasure for a handful of glittering dust and was now left with nothing. The fallout from Vanessa and Simon's scheme was swift and brutal. The ensuing scandal ripped through the city's financial and architectural circles. Sterling and Finch managed to survive, but its reputation was deeply tarnished. Ethan, as the senior associate who had championed Vanessa and signed off on her fraudulent projects, became the primary scapegoat. Though cleared of criminal complicity, he was professionally disgraced. Fired from the firm and blackballed in the industry, his career was over. The Zenith Tower condo was seized as part of the asset recovery, and he was left with a mountain of legal debt and the wreckage of his ambition. Vanessa and Simon were never apprehended. They had vanished, leaving a cold trail that ended somewhere in the Caribbean. Ethan tried to contact Sophie a few more times, pathetic rambling voicemails left in the middle of the night. She never answered. She had instructed her lawyer to handle all communication regarding child support, which Ethan, now working a low-wage job in retail logistics, was ordered by the court to pay. The meager monthly checks were a pittance compared to the bakery's profits, but Sophie insisted he pay them. It wasn't about the money. It was about forcing him to acknowledge the one responsibility he couldn't escape. Sophie, in contrast, was thriving. Haven and Hearth Bakery became a runaway success story. The corporate contract with Sterling and Finch led to others. Within 2 years of opening, she launched a second, larger location in the city's bustling financial district. She was featured in national magazines, not as a victim, but as an inspiring entrepreneur. Her story of turning personal devastation into professional triumph resonated with thousands. She became a sought-after speaker at business conferences for women. Her message always the same: your greatest strength is often forged in your deepest pain. She never sought revenge on Ethan. She didn't need to. Her success was not a reaction to his failure. It was a testament to her own strength, creativity, and resilience. She had built a life so full and joyful that he had become a footnote, a hazy memory from a past that felt like it belonged to someone else. Her world was rich and vibrant. It was filled with the laughter of her son Leo, who was now a happy, rambunctious toddler. It was filled with the loyal friendship of Olivia, who was Leo's godmother and Sophie's ever-present reality check. It was filled with the quiet wisdom of Mr. Davies, who served as the chairman on her company's advisory board and took immense joy in Leo's weekly visits. Her life was filled with the satisfaction of her work, the camaraderie of her growing team of employees, and the quiet moments of peace in her own home, a place she had secured through her own hard work. One sunny afternoon, about 3 years after he had left Sophie, was in Westwood Park with Leo pushing him on the swings. He was squealing with delight, his little legs kicking towards the sky. She was watching him. Her heart so full of love, it felt like it might burst when she saw a familiar figure on a nearby bench. It was Ethan. He looked older than his years, worn down by life. He was thin, dressed in nondescript clothes, and stared blankly at the ground. He hadn't seen her. He was just a man on a park bench, anonymous and defeated. The powerful, arrogant man who had shattered her world was gone, replaced by this sad, empty stranger. Sophie felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no lingering affection. just a profound sense of distance. He was a character from a book she had read a long time ago, whose story had no bearing on her own. She stopped the swing and lifted a giggling Leo into her arms, burying her face in his soft hair, inhaling the sweet scent of her son, her life, her future. Without a backward glance at the man on the bench, she turned and walked away towards the sunshine. She was not a woman who had been abandoned. She was a woman who had been liberated. She had lost a husband, but had found herself. And in the end, she had built her own kingdom, not as a spurned wife, but as a queen on her own throne, reigning over a life more wonderful than any she had ever dared to paint on a nursery wall. Sophie's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the end of one road is simply the beginning of a grander highway. Betrayal and heartbreak can feel like the end of the world, but they can also be the fire that forges us into something stronger, more resilient, and more truly ourselves. She didn't let another person's betrayal define her future. She picked up the broken pieces and built an empire that was entirely her own. Have you ever faced a moment that felt like the end, only to find a new beginning? Have you discovered a strength you never knew you had when pushed to your absolute limit? Share your own stories of resilience and reinvention in the comments below. We draw strength from one another. The gavel fell its sharp crack, lost in the cavernous silence of the ornate courtroom. All eyes were on Thomas Braddock, a man whose expensive suit couldn't conceal the ugliness twisting his handsome features. He pointed a trembling manicured finger not at the opposing counsel, but at his own pregnant wife, Felicia. She was a mistake. He spat the venomous words echoing off the polished marble. A disastrous, regrettable mistake. And that thing she's carrying is a mistake I refuse to pay for. A wave of gasps rippled through the gallery. But the real drama wasn't in his calculated cruelty. It was in the worn, leather-bound folder the judge had just placed on his bench. A folder containing the last will and testament of the one man Thomas could never bully his late father. The air in courtroom 4B of the San Mateo County Superior Court was thick with the perfume of old money and fresh animosity. It was a sterile, impersonal space, all mahogany panels and muted grey carpeting, yet it had become the arena for the deeply personal evisceration of a marriage. Felicia Vale, soon to be she hoped, Felicia Vale once more sat ramrod straight in her cushioned chair. Her hands resting protectively over the pronounced swell of her stomach were the only part of her that betrayed the tremor running through her body. At 32, she still possessed the quiet, bookish beauty that had first caught Thomas Braddock's eye. Thoughtful grey eyes, a cascade of chestnut hair she'd simply pinned back, and a complexion that had never needed the heavy-handed ministrations of the Braddock family's preferred aestheticians. Today, however, that beauty was shadowed by a weariness that went bone deep. She felt less like a person and more like a legal exhibit, the pregnant wife. Across the aisle, Thomas Braddock sat flanked by his lawyer, a shark in a Savile Row suit named Sterling, and his mother, Isabella Braddock. Thomas was the picture of wounded pride, his jaw tight, his brow furrowed in a performance of aggrieved masculinity. He was, Felicia had once thought, devastatingly handsome. Now she saw the weakness in his chin, the petulance in the downturn of his lips. He was a boy playing at being a king, and his mother Isabella was the silent, unyielding power behind the throne. Isabella Braddock was a masterpiece of preserved aristocracy. Her silver hair was coiffed into a helmet of glacial perfection. Her pearls were real, Her Chanel suit was vintage, and her disdain was palpable. She hadn't looked at Felicia once, preferring to stare at the judge as if he were a tardy waiter. From the moment Thomas had brought Felicia home to the sprawling Braddock estate in Atherton, Isabella had treated her not as a future daughter-in-law, but as a hostile takeover bid. Felicia wasn't old money. Her father was a history professor, her mother a librarian. To the Braddocks, whose wealth stretched back to the railroad barons, Felicia was a curious little commoner, a temporary amusement for their heir. Mr. Braddock, Judge Albright, said his voice a low gravel that commanded attention. He was a man in his 60s, with a weary face that had seen every flavor of human depravity. "We are here to discuss the division of assets in your divorce proceedings. Let's try to maintain a certain level of decorum." Thomas's lawyer, Mr. Sterling, rose smoothly. "Your Honor, my client's emotional state is merely a reflection of the deep betrayal he has suffered. He entered into this marriage in good faith, only to find—" Felicia's lawyer, a kind but firm woman named Maria Davies, cut him off. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is testifying. The betrayal Mr. Sterling refers to is my client's discovery that the prenuptial agreement Mr. Braddock forced upon her was not only unconscionable, but deliberately misleading. The prenup, the infamous document Isabella had presented to Felicia a week before the wedding. It had been an ambush styled as a casual chat over tea in the solarium. "Just a formality, dear," Isabella had purred, sliding the thick document across the glass table. "A way to keep things tidy. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings down the line." Thomas had backed his mother, of course. "It's just how things are done, Ellie," he'd said, avoiding her eyes. "It doesn't mean anything." It had meant everything. It had stipulated that in the event of a divorce, Felicia would walk away with nothing. Not a penny of the Braddock fortune, no claim to their properties, not even alimony. At the time, blinded by love and a naive belief in their future, she had signed it. Now, with a child on the way, a Braddock heir, the document was a cudgel they were using to beat her into submission. They offered her a one-time payout of $50,000 and a non-disclosure agreement so restrictive it would essentially erase her from their history. The validity of the prenuptial agreement is what we are here to debate. Judge Albright stated, his gaze fixed on Thomas. "But your personal feelings about your wife are for the moment irrelevant." This seemed to be the wrong thing to say. Thomas, who had been simmering, suddenly boiled over. He stood up, knocking his chair back slightly. "Irrelevant," he scoffed, his voice rising. "She is the most relevant mistake I've ever made. I was trapped. My father was ill, he was fond of her for some reason, and I went along with it." He gestured wildly towards Felicia. "She's a gold digger, Your Honor. A clever little parasite who saw a meal ticket and latched on." Maria Davies was on her feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." But the judge simply raised a hand, silencing her. He was watching Thomas, his expression unreadable. And Thomas, emboldened by the attention, took a step forward. He locked eyes with Felicia, and the mask of the charming, carefree man she had married fell away completely, revealing the snarling, entitled creature beneath. "Do you know what she did?" He addressed the judge, but his words were daggers aimed at her heart. "She got pregnant on purpose. After I told her we should wait. After I told her things were not working out. She did it to trap me, to try and secure a piece of my family's legacy." Felicia felt the blood drain from her face. It was a lie. A vicious, calculated lie. They had been trying for a baby. It was Thomas who had been excited, who had talked about names, who had held her, and whispered dreams of their future family into her hair. That was before his father Arthur Braddock had passed away 2 months ago, before Isabella had sunk her claws back into her son's soul. Then came the words that would be seared into her memory forever. Thomas's voice dropped, becoming low and guttural, dripping with a contempt so profound it physically hurt her. She was a mistake, he repeated, pointing at her belly. And that thing she's carrying is a mistake I refuse to pay for. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Felicia felt it like a physical blow. The baby inside her, their child, kicked as if in protest. Tears welled hot and fast, blurring the cruel face of the man she had loved. She saw Isabella smirk, a flicker of triumphant malice. This was what they wanted. To break her. To humiliate her so completely she would crawl away and accept their scraps. That is enough. Mr. Braddock. Judge Albright's voice was no longer weary. It was thunder. He slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing the shattering of Felicia's world. That is more than enough. You will sit down now. Thomas, looking slightly stunned by his own outburst, sank back into his chair, though his hateful glare remained fixed on Felicia. Judge Albright surveyed the scene, his eyes lingering on Felicia's tear-streaked face, then on Isabella's smug one. He took a deep, steadying breath and squared a stack of papers on his bench. This court is in recess for 15 minutes, he announced. However, before we break, a matter has been brought to my attention this morning by the executor of the late Arthur Braddock's estate. At the mention of his father, Thomas sat up straighter. A flicker of something confusion, perhaps apprehension, crossed his face. The judge picked up the worn, leather-bound folder. It appears that Mr. Arthur Braddock's final will and testament, executed 1 month prior to his death, contains certain stipulations that have a direct and material bearing on the assets currently under discussion in this divorce. With the executor's permission, and given its relevance, I am unsealing it now. He opened the folder. The silence in the courtroom returned, but this time it was different. It was thick with confusion and a dawning electric tension. A will, Arthur's will, had been read weeks ago. It was simple, leaving everything to his only son Thomas, with a generous trust for Isabella. What was this? Felicia wiped her tears, her heart pounding a strange new rhythm. Arthur. Kind, gentle Arthur. He had been the only Braddock who had ever truly seen her, the only one who had ever been on her side. In his final months as his illness worsened, he would often ask her to sit with him in the garden, away from the oppressive gloom of the mansion and the even more oppressive presence of his wife. They would talk for hours about history, about books, about her dreams for the future. He seemed to understand her in a way Thomas never had. What is the meaning of this, Your Honor? Mr. Sterling asked, his composure ruffled for the first time. A new will. We were not informed, it would seem Mr. Sterling, the judge, said, peering over his spectacles at the document, that no one was. Arthur Braddock was a very thorough man. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room, and began to read. As Judge Albright's voice began to drone through the legalese of the will's preamble, Felicia's mind spun backwards, away from the sterile cruelty of the courtroom to the sun-dappled lawns of the Braddock estate. She remembered the first time she'd met Arthur Braddock. It was 1.5 years ago. Thomas had brought her to the family's annual summer gala, a lavish affair of champagne fountains and string quartets. She'd been terrified a simple librarian's daughter adrift in a sea of couture and condescension. Isabella had introduced her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her tone making Felicia Vale sound like a quaint, unlisted company. Felicia had escaped to the rose garden, overwhelmed when she found a man in a tweed jacket, his back to her, carefully pruning a climbing rose. He turned, and his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held a warmth that was entirely absent from the main party. This was Arthur Braddock. "Ah, you've found my hiding spot," he'd said with a gentle smile. "Don't worry, I won't tell if you don't." They talked for nearly an hour. He didn't ask about her family's money or connections. He asked what she was reading. He asked about her work at the San Francisco Public Library, his face lighting up when she described her passion for historical archives. He spoke of his own love for history, a passion he lamented his son did not share. "Thomas sees history as a list of assets acquired," Arthur had said, with a sad, knowing sigh. "He sees the names Rockefeller, Carnegie, Braddock. But he doesn't understand the stories, the humanity." In that single conversation, Arthur had shown her more genuine interest and kindness than Isabella had in 6 months of strained dinners. He saw her not as an attachment to his son, but as a person. Over the next year, he became her quiet ally in the gilded cage of the Braddock family. While Isabella laid subtle traps, and Thomas grew more distant under his mother's influence, Arthur would seek Felicia out. He'd leave a rare first-edition book on her bedside table or invite her to walk the grounds, sharing stories of the family that were not about wealth, but about love, loss, and folly. He was already ill then, a creeping lung disease that stole his breath but never his sharp intellect. As his condition worsened, the dynamic in the house shifted. Isabella became more controlling, treating her husband's illness as an inconvenience and tightening her grip on Thomas. The pregnancy had been a brief, shining moment of hope. Thomas had been ecstatic at first. It was his idea, a way to, as he'd put it, finally start our own family away from all the pressure. They'd celebrated with a trip to Big Sur, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the estate. He had put his hands on her still flat stomach and spoken of a future that felt real and full of love. The moment they returned, Isabella shattered it. Felicia overheard the argument from the top of the grand staircase. A baby. Isabella's voice was like ice. "Now, Thomas, you are an imbecile. You have no idea what you've done." "Mother, it's my child. Our child. I love Ellie." "Love," she'd scoffed. "You are infatuated with a librarian, Thomas, a nobody. And now she has tethered herself to our legacy with the oldest trick in the book. Do you think for 1 second she wasn't planning this? To tie you down, to make herself indispensable." The poison took root quickly. Thomas began to pull away. He started spending more time at the office, coming home late, smelling of expensive whiskey and another woman's perfume. The excuses were flimsy, the apologies hollow. He grew short-tempered, echoing his mother's criticisms. He'd comment on Felicia's clothes, her friends, her lack of ambition. Then Arthur's health took a steep decline. In his last weeks, he was confined to his bed. The house was somber and quiet. Isabella managed his care with ruthless efficiency, keeping visitors to a minimum. But Arthur would still ask for Felicia. One afternoon, just a month before he died, he beckoned her close. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were lucid. "Felicia," he rasped, taking her hand. His own was frail, all paper-thin skin and bone. "Don't let them break you. You have more strength than any of them." He'd looked pointedly at her stomach. "And you have a responsibility to that child, a responsibility to be strong." He'd made her promise. She hadn't understood the full weight of his words then. 2 weeks later, he summoned his personal attorney, a man Felicia had never met, to the house. Isabella had been furious, trying to insist that the family lawyer, Mr. Sterling, be present. Arthur, with a surprising burst of strength, had refused. "This is a private matter, Isabella," he'd said. The meeting had lasted for 3 hours. The next day Arthur seemed more at peace. He passed away in his sleep a month later. The first reading of the will had been exactly what everyone expected. A simple document leaving Braddock Enterprises and the bulk of the estate to Thomas. Isabella was granted a lifelong right to live in the family mansion and a generous stipend from a separate trust. It was so straightforward that Thomas had smirked a look of vindicated relief on his face. With his father gone, the final obstacle to his absolute inheritance and Isabella's absolute influence was removed. 2 days after that, Thomas had asked for a divorce. The words were cold, rehearsed. He'd said the marriage was a mistake, that he'd been pressured by his father's failing health. He presented it as a clean break, a return to the natural order of things. When Felicia, heartbroken and 7 months pregnant, had refused to be discarded so easily, he had turned vicious. The battle over the prenup began, and now here they were. A sharp intake of breath from Mr. Sterling snapped Felicia back to the present. Judge Albright had finished with the preliminary sections of the will. His eyes scanned the room before continuing. "We now come to Article 4. The judge said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing every ounce of attention in the room. "Regarding the disposition of my primary asset, my controlling interest in Braddock Enterprises Incorporated." Thomas leaned forward, a smug look returning to his face. This was it, the confirmation of his kingdom. "I, Arthur Braddock," the judge read his voice, clear and deliberate, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare the following. My son Thomas Braddock has in recent months shown a lamentable lack of judgment and a character ill-suited to the stewardship of the company my grandfather built." A jolt went through the room. Thomas's face went from smug to slack-jawed shock. Isabella's carefully constructed composure cracked her mouth, falling open slightly. What Thomas whispered the word stolen by the cavernous room. The judge continued, his voice unwavering. "He has proven himself to be easily manipulated and has forgotten the most fundamental principle of our family's success, that our name is built on integrity, not just on assets. Therefore, I cannot in good conscience deliver the future of Braddock Enterprises into his hands." "This is insane," Sterling blurted out, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, my client's father was clearly not of sound mind. He was heavily medicated. He was certified of sound mind by 2 independent physicians the day this will was signed, Mr. Sterling. Their affidavits are attached," Judge Albright said coolly, not even looking up. "Now sit down." Sterling sank back into his chair, his face pale. The judge's eyes found Felicia's across the room. She held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. He went on. "Therefore, I hereby bequeath my entire controlling share of Braddock Enterprises, representing 51% of the voting stock, not to my son, but to a trust. This trust shall be known as the Arthur Vale Braddock Legacy Trust." Vale. He had used her maiden name. A low, guttural sound escaped Isabella's throat. The judge continued reading the clause that would change everything. "The sole beneficiary of this trust is to be my first-born grandchild, the child currently carried by my daughter-in-law, Felicia Vale Braddock. The courtroom devolved into a cacophony of frantic whispers. Thomas looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He stared at Felicia's belly, not with contempt, but with a dawning, horrified awe. That mistake, was now the majority shareholder of his entire inheritance. But Arthur Braddock wasn't finished. The final killing blow was yet to come. Judge Albright looked up from the document, his gaze passing over Thomas and Isabella, before settling once more on Felicia. He read the last sentence of the article, his voice ringing with a profound posthumous finality. The sole executor and trustee of this trust, vested with absolute and unconditional authority over all voting rights, board appointments, and financial decisions of Bob Braddock Enterprises, until the beneficiary reaches the age of 25, shall be the child's mother, and my trusted daughter-in-law, Felicia Vale Braddock. For a long moment, the world stopped. The frantic whispers died. The rustling of papers ceased. The only sound in courtroom 4B was the frantic, trapped beat of Felicia's own heart. She stared at Judge Albright, certain she had misheard, that the grief and stress had finally caused her to hallucinate. Sole executor and trustee, absolute and unconditional authority. The words didn't compute. They were abstract alien concepts that didn't belong to her. Felicia Vale, the librarian, the spurned wife, the humiliated mother-to-be. Then the spell broke. A strangled cry tore from Isabella Braddock's throat. It was a sound of pure, undiluted fury, the cry of a queen who has just watched her castle crumble into dust. "No, it's a lie, a forgery!" she shrieked, lurching to her feet. Her mask of aristocratic control was gone, replaced by a visage of raw, twitching rage. That woman, that scheming little harlot, she manipulated him. She poisoned my husband against his own family. Mr. Sterling, his face the color of ash, tried to restrain her, whispering urgently. "Isabella, not here. Control yourself." But she was beyond control. She pointed a trembling, diamond-clad finger at Felicia. This was your plan all along. You seduced a dying old man, twisted his mind." "Mrs. Braddock." Judge Albright's voice cracked like a whip. "You are on the verge of being held in contempt. Another outburst like that, and you will be removed by the bailiff." Isabella snapped her mouth shut, but her chest heaved, and her eyes fixed on Felicia promised retribution. Thomas was eerily silent. He sat frozen, his body rigid, his eyes wide and vacant. He was staring at the polished table in front of him, but he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing his entire world, the one he had been promised from birth, vanish before his eyes. The kingdom he was meant to inherit, the power he was meant to wield, had just been handed lock, stock, and barrel to the woman he had publicly disavowed, and the unborn child he had branded a mistake. Felicia's lawyer, Maria Davies, leaned over her, voice a low, steady murmur in Felicia's ear. "Felicia, did you hear that? Do you understand what this means?" Felicia could only shake her head slowly, her mind a whirlwind of shock. She looked from Thomas's shattered expression to Isabella's murderous glare. She felt a kick, a strong, solid thump from within, a reminder of the tiny, unknowing beneficiary at the center of this cataclysm. Judge Albright, seemingly unfazed by the eruption, continued as if reading a grocery list. "The will goes on to state," he said, his voice cutting through the residual tension, "that Thomas Braddock is to be granted a salaried position as President of Operations, reporting directly to the Board of Directors. A board that the new trustee," he paused, looking directly at Felicia, "has the sole authority to appoint or dismiss." The implication was brutally clear. Thomas was no longer the heir apparent. He was an employee who could be fired. By her. Furthermore, the judge added, the will stipulates that Thomas Braddock and Isabella Braddock are permitted to maintain residence in the Atherton family home, but only with the express ongoing permission of the trustee. The deed and title of the property are to be transferred to the Arthur Vale Braddock Legacy Trust. They were tenants in their own home. Their right to live there was now entirely at Felicia's discretion. The finality of it was absolute. Arthur hadn't just disinherited his son. He had orchestrated a complete coup d'etat from beyond the grave. He had seen the cruelty, the weakness, the greed, and he had built a fortress to protect his grandchild and the woman he believed could safeguard his legacy. He hadn't just given Felicia a shield, he had given her a sword, an arsenal, an entire kingdom. The will Judge Albright concluded, closing the leather folder with a soft thud. Is accompanied by a signed and notarized letter from Arthur Braddock detailing his reasons. It explains his concerns over his son's profligate spending his susceptibility to his mother's corrosive influence and his cruel and dishonorable treatment of his pregnant wife. The letter states, and I quote, I have observed Felicia for 2 years. She possesses an integrity my son sorely lacks. She is intelligent, compassionate, and her loyalty is not to money but to family. I do not give her this power to punish my son, but to protect my grandchild. I trust her to do what is right. The judge looked at Thomas. The letter also expresses hope, Mr. Braddock, that this drastic but necessary action will provide you with an opportunity to rediscover the man you were meant to be, not the man your mother wants you to be. That last line was a dagger meant for Isabella, and it hit its mark. She flinched as if struck. Judge Albright removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Given these revelations, he stated, his voice returning to its official, dispassionate tone, the financial landscape of this divorce has been fundamentally altered. The prenuptial agreement is now entirely moot, as the primary assets Mr. Braddock believed were his to protect are in fact not his. The $50,000 settlement offered to Mrs. Braddock is, to put it mildly, insufficient. He looked at Felicia, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something almost like a smile in his tired eyes. In fact, Mrs. Braddock is now, for all intents and purposes, the single most powerful financial entity in this room. The assets belong to the trust she controls. He turned to the stunned lawyers. I am dissolving these proceedings for today. I suggest you all go home, absorb the contents of this will, and reschedule when you have a more realistic grasp of your clients' respective situations. Mr. Sterling, he added pointedly, you may want to advise your client that his wife's mistake now controls his salary, his home, and his future. A bit of humility might be in order. With a final sharp rap of the gavel, he declared, Court is adjourned. The judge rose and swept out of the room, leaving a vortex of stunned silence in his wake. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, chaos erupted. Reporters who had been lurking in the gallery rushed towards the doors. Sterling was frantically trying to speak to Thomas, who was still catatonic. Maria Davies was patting Felicia's shoulder, her face a mixture of shock and elation. Felicia slowly got to her feet, her legs unsteady. She felt dizzy, disconnected from her own body. Isabella was the first to move towards her, her face a terrifying mask of fury. She stalked across the aisle, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. You will not get away with this, Isabella hissed, her voice low and venomous, close enough for Felicia to smell her cloyingly expensive perfume. I will fight this. I will prove you are an unfit mother. I will drag your name through so much mud you'll drown in it. That baby will never see a penny." Before Felicia could react, a figure stepped between them. It was Thomas. His face was ashen, his eyes wild with a desperate, frantic energy. He looked from his mother to Felicia, then back again. "Mother, stop," he said, his voice hoarse. "Just stop." He then turned to Felicia. The contempt was gone, replaced by a raw, pleading panic. The man who not 20 minutes ago had called her and their child a mistake now looked at her as if she were a lifeline. "Ellie," he began, his voice cracking. He even reached a hand out as if to touch her arm before letting it fall. "Ellie, I didn't mean it. You have to believe me. I was angry. I was pressured." His eyes flickered towards his mother. "We can fix this, you and me. We can stop the divorce. We can raise the baby together, in our house." The audacity of it was breathtaking. The whiplash of his transformation from tyrant to supplicant was so sudden it was nauseating. He wasn't apologizing for the cruelty. He was trying to reverse a transaction that had gone horribly wrong for him. He didn't see a wife he had wounded. He saw the new CEO of his life. Felicia looked at his desperate, pleading face. She looked at Isabella, who was watching them with narrowed, calculating eyes, her mind already plotting new strategies. And she felt nothing. Not love, not hate, not even anger anymore. Just a profound, chilling emptiness where her love for him used to be. She looked at his outstretched, trembling hand. Then she looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and steady for the first time that day. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving her husband and his mother standing in the ruins of their fallen kingdom. Her lawyer Maria rushed to her side, and together they walked out of the courtroom. Not towards a miserable, uncertain future, but towards an empire Felicia had never asked for, but now, by the grace of a good man's final act, commanded. The days that followed the courtroom bombshell were a blur of surreal adjustments. Felicia didn't return to the small rented apartment she had secured as a refuge from her marriage. Maria Davies had insisted it wasn't secure enough. "You're not just a private citizen anymore, Felicia," she'd said, her tone urgent. "You are the head of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. There are protocols now." And so Felicia found herself in a gilded prison of a different sort, a penthouse suite at the Four Seasons paid for by the Arthur Vale Braddock Legacy Trust, with a round-the-clock security detail stationed in the hallway, lawyers, trust officers, and financial advisors. Men and women with sharp suits and even sharper minds. All remnants of Arthur's loyal inner circle paraded through her living room. They presented her with binders thick with financial reports, organizational charts, and legal obligations. They used terms like fiduciary duty, hostile takeover defenses, and quarterly earnings projections. At first, it was overwhelmingly intimidating. She was Felicia Vale, who found comfort in the Dewey Decimal System, not the Dow Jones Industrial Average. But as they spoke, she listened. She asked questions, simple ones at first, then more complex ones. And she discovered something surprising. The logic of it, the intricate web of cause and effect, wasn't so different from tracing historical events or archival records. It was a story just told in the language of numbers. More importantly, she was fueled by a powerful clarifying force, the memory of Arthur's words, "I trust her to do what is right," and the visceral, soul-crushing memory of Thomas's "that thing she's carrying is a mistake." One was a sacred trust, the other a declaration of war. She would honor the former, by prevailing in the latter. Her phone rang incessantly. The calls were from Thomas. He left dozens of voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. They were a pathetic symphony of panicked apologies and self-serving promises. "Ellie, baby, please pick up. I'm so sorry. I've been such a fool. My mother, she gets in my head. But that's over now, I swear. I was just looking at the crib we ordered. Remember the one from that little shop in Carmel? It's all about us, Ellie. You, me, and our little boy. Or girl. It's all that matters. I told Sterling to fire his legal team. We don't need lawyers. We're a family. Just come home. Please, just come home, and we can figure this all out." She never answered. She never listened to a single message, twice. It was the desperate pleading of a man who had lost his wallet, not a husband who had broken his wife's heart. Isabella, for her part, had gone to ground. But it was a tactical silence, not a surrender. Maria's legal team reported that Isabella had hired a new, notoriously aggressive law firm, specializing in contesting wills. They were digging, searching for any doctor who would testify to Arthur's incompetence, any nurse who would claim Felicia had restricted access to him, any scrap of dirt they could find, to paint her as a manipulative usurper. A week after the hearing, Felicia knew she couldn't stay in the hotel forever. She had to make a move. The trust owned the Braddock mansion. It was her house now. More importantly, it was her child's house. Arthur had not intended for his grandchild to be raised in exile. So she made a decision. She called Maria. "I'm going home," she said, her voice firm. "Felicia is that wise. It's not about wisdom, Maria. It's about a clear message. The Queen is not in hiding." The return was as dramatic as she had intended. She didn't sneak in the back door. She arrived in a black town car, arranged by the trust, which swept up the long gravel driveway to the imposing facade of the Atherton mansion. As she stepped out of the car, the heavy front doors opened. Thomas stood there, his face a mixture of hope and terror. He had clearly been watching for her. He was dressed down in a cashmere sweater, an attempt to look soft, approachable. "Ellie." He breathed a relieved smile, touching his lips. "You're home." "I am," Felicia said, her tone cool and level. She walked past him into the cavernous marble-floored foyer. The air was still and smelled of lemon polish and lilies, just as it always had. "I've asked a moving company to clear out my old things from the guest wing. They will be delivering my new furniture for the nursery this afternoon." Thomas's smile faltered. "Of course, anything you want. I had Mrs. Albright air out the master suite for you. For us." Felicia stopped and turned to him. "Let's be very clear, Thomas. I am not here to reconcile. I am here because this is my home now. It belongs to the trust that I command. You and your mother are living here at my discretion." The words hung in the air, cold and hard. The color drained from Thomas's face. "My legal team," she continued, her voice devoid of emotion, "will be drawing up a tenancy at will agreement for you and Isabella. It will stipulate the terms of your continued residence. Furthermore, I am calling a board meeting for Braddock Enterprises for Monday morning. As president of operations, your attendance will be required. You'll be expected to present a full report on the company's current standing." She was no longer his wife. She was his landlord and his boss. The reality of it slammed into him, and his composure finally shattered. "Felicia, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't do this. Don't be like this. This isn't you. You're not this cold." "You're right," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "The woman I was would have forgiven you. She would have believed your lies and let you hurt her again. But you and your mother killed that woman. You stood in a court of law, and you killed her. So you'll have to get used to the woman who is left." Just then a sharp, imperious voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Isabella stood there, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, her face a thunderous mask. Felicia didn't even grant her a full glance. "Hello, Isabella," she said, her voice carrying easily in the grand space. "I'm home. I trust your new lawyers have explained the situation to you. You're a guest here. Try not to forget it." She turned and began to walk towards the east wing, where Arthur's private study was located. It had been her sanctuary with him, and it would now be her command center. "You will regret this," Isabella shrieked from the landing. "I will see you on the street." Felicia paused, her back still to them. "No, you won't," she said without turning around. "You will see me in the boardroom, Monday at 9 a.m. Don't be late." And with that, she walked away, leaving mother and son standing in the opulent foyer of a house that was no longer theirs, silenced by the quiet, unshakable authority of the woman they had tried and failed to destroy. The following months were a masterclass in trench warfare, fought not with bullets, but with board appointments and legal briefs. Felicia, now 8 and then 9 months pregnant, moved not with the timid uncertainty of a librarian, but with the deliberate, focused strategy of a general. Arthur's study became her war room. Its rich, leather-bound books on military history and corporate biography now seemed less like a collection and more like a curated library of tactics left for her by a brilliant mentor. Her first move was the board meeting. She walked into the Braddock Enterprises boardroom, a long, intimidating chamber dominated by a colossal mahogany table and portraits of stern-faced Braddock men, and every head turned. The existing board members, all cronies of Thomas and Isabella, looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and thinly veiled contempt. Thomas sat at the head of the table, a place he had occupied for less than 3 months. Felicia, guided by Maria, and the Trust's chief counsel took the seat directly opposite him. She didn't claim his chair. She created a new center of power. She let Thomas run through his report, a rambling, jargon-filled presentation clearly designed to intimidate and confuse her. When he finished, he looked at her, a challenge in his eyes. Felicia didn't respond directly to his report. Instead, she introduced the Trust's counsel, who then calmly and methodically laid out the legal reality of the new ownership structure. Then Felicia spoke. "Thank you, Thomas, for that overview," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "In my capacity as trustee, my primary duty is to ensure the long-term health and integrity of this company for the sole beneficiary. To that end, I have spent the last week reviewing the company's performance, its leadership and its vision, and I have found it lacking." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Effective immediately, I am exercising my authority as trustee to reconstitute the board of directors. Mr. Henderson, Ms. Albright, Mr. Chen," she said, naming 3 of Isabella's oldest and most loyal allies. "Your positions on this board are terminated. Thank you for your service." The 3 of them stared aghast. "You can't do that," one of them sputtered. "She can, and she has," the Trust's lawyer interjected smoothly. Felicia continued, her gaze sweeping the table. "In their place, I am appointing 3 new members. First, Ms. Maria Davies, whose legal expertise will be invaluable. Second, Mr. Alistair Finch." She named Arthur's long-time, fiercely loyal financial advisor, a man Isabella had forced into retirement. And third, Dr. Lena Petrova, a leading expert in sustainable business ethics from Stanford University. Arthur Braddock often spoke of creating a legacy, not just a profit margin. We will honor that vision. It was a coup. Clean, swift, and utterly devastating. She had decapitated Isabella's power base within the company in less than 5 minutes. Thomas sat impotent, watching his allies pack their briefcases in stunned silence. He was still president, but he was now a president who answered to a board that was loyal to her. Life in the mansion was a silent, cold war. Felicia took over the master wing, while Thomas and Isabella were confined to the guest suites. They shared the same roof, passed each other in the long hallways like ghosts, and ate meals at different times to avoid contact. Isabella's attempts at psychological warfare, leaving old happy photos of her and Thomas out making loud, pitying phone calls about poor, confused Felicia, were met with a wall of serene, impenetrable silence. Thomas, meanwhile, swung wildly between pathetic attempts at reconciliation and sullen resentment. He'd leave a single rose on her desk one day, and the next he'd make a sarcastic comment about her playing CEO at the dinner table. Felicia ignored it all. Her focus was singular, the baby and the business. She found an unexpected strength in the routine. She'd wake early, walk the gardens as she had with Arthur, and then spend hours with Alistair Finch, the reappointed advisor. He would patiently walk her through balance sheets and investment portfolios, marveling at her quick grasp of complex ideas. "Your father-in-law was right about you," he said one afternoon. "You have a formidable mind, Mrs. Braddock. You see the whole chessboard." The one front where Isabella believed she could still win was the legal challenge to the will. Her lawyers filed motion after motion, claiming undue influence and testamentary incapacity. They deposed nurses, gardeners, and cooks, searching for any hint that Felicia had manipulated a dying man. The case was set to be heard by Judge Albright once again. Isabella was confident. She believed, found a star witness, a disgruntled former nurse, whom Isabella had paid handsomely to testify that Felicia had constantly bad-mouthed Thomas and Isabella to Arthur, poisoning his mind in his final days. The day before the hearing, Felicia was in the nursery putting the finishing touches on the room. It was painted a soft, gentle yellow, with a mural of a forest scene on one wall. As she stood there, her hands on her huge belly, feeling the strong, steady kicks of her child, she felt a profound sense of peace. She was ready for whatever came next. That evening, a courier delivered a small sealed package to her. It was from Arthur's personal attorney, the executor of the estate. The accompanying note was brief. "Arthur asked me to give this to you if Isabella ever formally contested the will. He called it insurance." Felicia's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was not a document, but a small, solid-state audio recorder and a single key. Confused, she pressed play. The voice that filled the silent room was Arthur's. It was weak, raspy, clearly recorded in his last weeks, but it was unmistakably him. "If you are hearing this, Felicia," the recording began, "it means Isabella is trying to undo my final wishes. I am not surprised. Her greed has always been her most defining trait. I want you in the court to know the truth." Arthur's recorded voice then detailed with painful clarity Isabella's emotional cruelty throughout their marriage, her constant manipulation of their son, and her open contempt for Felicia. He spoke of how Isabella had tried to bar Felicia from his room, how she had dismissed his doctors and tried to bring in her own specialists who would declare him incompetent. "But the most important evidence," Arthur's voice continued, "is not my words. but hers. Last week, she did not know I had my lawyer install a small recording device in this room, activated by voice. She came in, believing me to be asleep to speak with Thomas. They thought they were alone. The recording is on this device. The key is to my old safe in the study. The evidence inside will corroborate everything. Felicia's blood ran cold. She stopped the recording, her heart pounding. She took the small antique key, went to the study, and opened the safe she never knew existed, hidden behind a false panel of books. Inside was a folder. It contained copies of emails between Isabella and a private investigator she had hired to dig up dirt on Felicia a year ago. It contained financial records showing large payments to the disgruntled nurse. And it contained a second audio recorder. With a deep breath, she pressed play. This time the voices were clearer. It was Isabella and Thomas in Arthur's room, thinking he was sedated and unconscious. Isabella's voice was sharp, cutting. "You have to divorce her the moment he's gone, Thomas. Not a day later. Offer her a pittance. Humiliate her. Make her crawl back to whatever hovel she came from. We cannot have that common bloodline infecting this family." Then Thomas's voice, weak and compliant. "And the baby? What do I do about the baby?" "The baby is a non-issue," Isabella had replied coldly. "We'll claim she trapped you. We'll claim it might not even be yours. We will drag her through a custody battle that will break her. In the end, she'll give it all up just to have peace. The Braddock legacy will remain pure. Your father in his senile state may be fond of her, but we will protect our family from his sentimentality." Felicia sank into a chair, the audio recorder slipping from her fingers. It wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a confession. They had laid out their entire vicious plan in the presence of the very man whose legacy they sought to protect. She now held more than just a defense. She held a weapon of annihilation. The hearing was tomorrow, and she knew exactly what she was going to do. The morning of the hearing was grey and overcast. Isabella Braddock arrived looking imperious and confident, her paid star witness, Nurse Brenda, trailing in her wake. Thomas followed, looking haggard, a man caught in an inescapable vice. Felicia entered last, calm and composed, carrying a simple leather briefcase. Isabella's lawyer, Fletcher, called his witness. Nurse Brenda took the stand and delivered a tearful, practiced performance, painting Felicia as a cunning manipulator who had poisoned a dying, vulnerable Arthur against his loving family. She would whisper insults about Mrs. Braddock and Thomas for hours, the nurse claimed, dabbing a fake tear. She twisted his every thought. It was heartbreaking. When it was Maria Davies's turn, she approached the stand with lethal calm. "Nurse Brenda," she began, "aside from your salary, were you paid any other amounts by Isabella Braddock? Specifically, a sum of $250,000 transferred to an offshore account 2 days after Arthur Braddock's death." The nurse's face went white. Fletcher shot to his feet, shouting objections, but Judge Albright overruled him instantly. "Answer the question, Nurse Brenda." The witness stammered, her lies collapsing under the weight of a single damning question. But this was only the opening salvo. At a nod from Maria, Felicia stood the proud swell of her pregnancy, a silent testament to everything at stake. "Your Honor," Felicia said, her voice ringing with newfound strength, "I would like to present new evidence that will clarify the true nature of the influence surrounding Arthur Braddock in his final days." She opened her briefcase and removed a small audio recorder. "This is a recording made by my father-in-law himself. He left it for me in the event of this exact scenario. She pressed play. Arthur's weak, rasping voice filled the stunned courtroom. He spoke of his faith in Felicia's character and his deep disappointment in his son and wife. A visible shockwave went through the room when he mentioned a second recording one he had secretly made of Isabella and Thomas. Isabella's face contorted a mask of dawning horror. And now, Felicia said, her voice cold as steel, as she held up the second device, the conversation Arthur spoke of, recorded in his room when they believed he was unconscious. She pressed play again. The courtroom was plunged into a chilling silence, broken only by the recorded voices of mother and son plotting Felicia's destruction. Isabella's voice, crisp and cruel. "You have to divorce her the moment he's gone. Humiliate her. Make her crawl. We cannot have that common bloodline infecting this family." Then Thomas, weak and complicit. And the baby. What do I do about the baby? And the final monstrous words from Isabella. The baby is a non-issue. We'll claim it might not even be yours. We will drag her through a custody battle that will break her. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute and condemning. Isabella was frozen in her chair, her face a grotesque tableau of public exposure and private ruin. Thomas had buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. His lawyer sat down, utterly defeated. Judge Albright stared at Isabella, his face a mask of cold fury. "Mrs. Braddock," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What you have just heard in your own words is a monstrous conspiracy to commit perjury and destroy an innocent woman. And you," he said, turning his glare on Thomas, "your cowardice is contemptible." He slammed his gavel, the sound like a gunshot. "The challenge to this will is dismissed with extreme prejudice. I am fining Mrs. Isabella Braddock $500,000 for malicious prosecution. And I am forwarding this audio evidence to the district attorney's office for investigation into potential criminal charges." His expression softened only when he looked at Felicia. "Mrs. Braddock, you have endured a trial by fire and proven your father-in-law's faith in you was not misplaced. You are free." It was over. Complete victory. As the court adjourned, Thomas finally lifted his head, his face ravaged by tears. He looked at Felicia, his eyes a bottomless well of self-loathing, knowing no words could ever bridge the chasm he had created. Felicia met his gaze not with triumph, but with a quiet, somber finality. She gave a single nod, an acknowledgement of the tragedy he had authored, then turned and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. 2 weeks later, Felicia gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. She named him Arthur. The day she brought him home, the mansion felt different. Isabella was gone, having retreated to await the results of the DA's investigation. Thomas remained a ghost in the guest wing. Felicia stood in the grand foyer, holding her tiny son. She looked up at the portrait of the first Arthur Braddock, then at the empty, faded space on the wall where Isabella's portrait used to hang. The house was no longer a cage or a battlefield. It was a sanctuary. It was home. Her son Arthur Vale Braddock cooed in his sleep, his tiny hand wrapped securely around her finger. He was not a mistake. He was a legacy. And she was his guardian. The past was a story of pain, but the future was hers to write. From courtroom humiliation to the head of an empire, Felicia Braddock's journey is a breathtaking saga of karmic justice. A husband's cruelty sparked his own downfall. But a father's final act of love provided the ultimate checkmate. She didn't just win her freedom, she inherited a fortune and proved that true power comes from character, not just a name. If you were moved by Felicia's incredible triumph, hit that like button to show your support. Share this story of empowerment with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another video where justice is finally served.